Fine.
All right. I was just saying that I'm probably gonna have some dumb questions because I'm new to the industry and I was in the Marine Corps and I've eaten a lot of crayons. So one thing I noticed on the previous form, the 2-pager, the short one of the questions was, do they have a pre-existing ESOP, the existing plan? Is that a no-go if they have, or can you work with a company that already has an ESOP in place?
No, based on what they've done, there's a lot of work. In fact, I was having some conversations with two people who called me and asked for a lunch and a breakfast together, and one was with a bank, and they've got a battery of, I mean, their work is with ESOPs, and the other one's with UBS. Their work is with funding the qualified replacement property fund. And in both cases, we talked about some of the opportunities there, because 85–90% of the ESOPs out there have not funded for their repurchase obligation. And the guy with the smaller bank, I think it was, oh shoot, I think it was, I've got a card laying around here somewhere, but they're actually doing the senior debt in most cases. And when I mentioned about the idea of funding the repurchase obligation and then having that sometimes be the insurance, which kills both birds with one stone, he says, we haven't been taking the key manager. I said, up until a few years ago, the SBA required key man insurance to protect the SBA. And he says, I like that idea. Yeah, so if they've already, I mean, one of the criteria for the other type of ESOP, I mean, the one that it was originally designed to be, and 99% of the ESOPs out there are what they call leveraged ESOPs, which means that they didn't start off as a contributory model like ours. They went right in with the idea. The guy got, just like in the webinar, like in the art. Oh, by the way, there's an article that just came out yesterday that I wrote for the California Broker. So in this month's California Broker is a 2-3 page article of kind of covering this stuff. It'll help a little bit in understanding, because you can go back to it and look at it and say, how's that worded, etc. But to get the capital gains savings in the sale model, in other words, where the guy wants to sell the company because he talked to the kids and they don't want it, so he's going to sell it. But he started off 30–40 years ago with like $10,000 working in the garage and built the business out. Now it's worth $30 million. Well, capital gains in California is nearly 40%. So if he sells that, $30 million company, he's going to lose almost $12 million. So they then look at things like ESOPs. Now, if somebody comes in and they're buying them way above value, like for whatever reason, a particular strategic equity group or somebody else wants that company, and they're willing to pay above the valuation price substantially, enough to offset the loss of the capital gains taxes, then that's another whole different scenario. So in most cases, when they go through that transition, like, hey, I've always counted on my kids taking it over and they don't want it, so I got to sell it. Well, statistically, over 80% of those people just liquidate, because they don't do an ESOP because they didn't know about it, or the CPA or the attorney didn't bring it up. The life insurance guy can't spell it. He doesn't know what an ESOP is. And so they just, let it go. Or he just keeps working till they carry him out on his shield. But then if they do initiate the ESOP situation, the goal is to sell at least 30% to the ESOP to hit the minimum threshold for the 1042 exchange, which is the capital gains savings. And once you get to that point, you're usually dealing with their particular bank. If they've been banking at Wells Fargo or whatever, whichever bank they're at, if they are familiar with ESOPs, the bank will engage for what they call the senior debt, which usually can go up to about 40–50% of the value of the business. And then at that point, they either take back the balance, or if they want more cash out, they'll go into mezzanine financing, get another 20, 25%. But in most cases, the ESOP sale, they don't get 100% until they've gotten into, say, 2-3 years after the sale, where they're still, they've taken back warrants, or they're taking a salary and still doing some consulting, and they're getting paid on the debt. And that debt is fairly high interest because you're in third position. So the idea of putting the planning together with the repurchase obligation funded, the key man insurance in place, not paying taxes on the income coming in, is favorable for any of those scenarios. In fact, I don't think I've found a scenario that we can't come in and find something where there's a crack in the cement somewhere.
Okay. It's not, I mean, from the case study that you had demonstrated in the webinar, it sounded like there was almost no downfall to doing this. So,
honestly, I can't find one.
So would a company be even, say it's a family-owned business and they plan on passing it on to family members? Could they not still go this route and transition the majority of the shares to, their son or nephew or whoever's going to take over this process?
Yeah, they can. It's done in a few different ways. In fact, yesterday I spent a lot of time going on the internet and going through a bunch of different ESOP presentations, everything from banks to other guys that manage the leveraged ESOPs. There's a lot of firms out there and a handful that are really good, like Ambrose Advisors. I work with them because we'll sometimes take in expert help from other groups. I mean, we've had conversations with BTA and a couple of their executives about doing kind of like a bridge relationship in terms of, if we know that there's going to be a sale within X number of years, we'll bring them in closer. And one of the things we do that it would not normally be done by a firm that's trying to do what we do, we bring in the fiduciary up front. We've been blessed to be introduced to a couple of good fiduciaries, but one in particular that used to be the head of the Department of Labor in going after all the bad ESOPs. And he was the ESOP guy. I call him the ESOP Gestapo, until he saw the light and came into the light side. Now he's with the force. He's guided by the force, right? And what he does is he keeps it tight up from the very beginning. In other words, the fiduciary usually isn't brought in until the time that they're going to engage someone to do the liquidity event and sell the stock to the ESOP for the exit. And that's critical for the fiduciary to be there at that point. But we're bringing him in up front because in most cases, we want to have it where we can hand it off, not leaving it, but hand it off in a collaboration with some of the leveraged ESOP groups out there. And that's all you find. If you go in the ESOP association and you see providers, they're either valuation people, third-party administrators, attorneys and CPA firms, or people that do kind of what we do, but mainly for leveraged ESOPs. And our model's not out there. So anybody that talks to anybody at the National Center for Employee Ownership, NCEO, or the ESOP Association, if they're in NCEO is a good source. In fact, when I'm going through all these different presentations, we're going to try to get like a 20-minute version, 40-minute version, 60-minute version. And then we're going to be doing a lot of them with CPA firms and law firms and stuff like that. And part of it will be giving out these books. And there's another, I'm trying to put together a book in terms of the new era of ESOPs that takes an expanded version of what we did on the webinar, plus the article. And when I mentioned it in the article, and if you do get California Broker, when I say this is only covering part of it, and then at the end I said there's a lot more to talk about. Well, there's case studies that line up. One of the things I want to do is take a case study where there's the three guys, same age, they're all contractors. They're all about the same amount of $20-30 million of revenue and all that stuff. The first guy is just basically a lifestyle guy. The guy that's he pounded nails from high school on, and he went out and got his contractor's license, and he takes his $2 million of profit, lets the IRS and Sacramento take their pound of flesh, and then he tries to save, buy a house, and mainly a lifestyle for the balance of the profit. The second guy, he takes a step. He's getting a pension in there, cash balance plan, all that kind of stuff, and he's buying life insurance, but he's buying 20-year term because that's what Susie Orman and Dave Ramsey say. And then third guy is doing our plan. And then I haven't done all the real fine numbers to it, but one of our guys in our group is he thinks he loves numbers, Excel spreadsheets. I don't think he sleeps, but
poor guy. Okay.
and so we'll put the three together, and that'll be that's to go through that enough. That's probably a good hour of conversation. And then a lot of things where we, a lot of other stuff that we'll be adding in that we can do a deep dive on an 831B captive. I've been vetting captives for 25 years. The first few I looked at early on are the reason that the IRS is after captives. I mean, they're trying to sell the life insurance inside the captive, and you put the money in December, borrow it back in January. I mean, anything you could do wrong, a lot of the captive groups are doing it. But there are a few out there that are really good, and they've consistently been good. And two of them now are AM best rated with an A rating. And so those are the two we're kind of primarily doing most of our work with. And if being new, Eric, if you've not examined captives, you might want to just go on the internet and read a little bit about it. I don't have any organic material, I think, easily
Eric,
available.
at some point I'll look it up and I'll start learning, because I barely know how to spell captive other than when we're talking about captive versus independent agents. So I barely know enough about captive to just be really dangerous. So don't get to the weeds. At some point I'll get there, and then we'll convene about that later.
Bottom line,
I have a page open. I opened a page on my browser to read more about it, because I wasn't familiar with it. So
like big captives have been around forever. I mean, offshore and those are usually common captives. They're an 831A, and those could have millions and millions of dollars of premiums in them, and they're heavily done actuarially. They're expensive to put together, and usually a captive might have 400 construction companies in it, or 400 law firms, or whatever, and they're common captives, and they're a lot tighter regulated. The IRS came out 30 years or whatever, and came out with the 831B, which at the beginning had a 1 million maximum premium, and it was a lot easier to conform to. And the essence was not like the offshore ones where they're reinsuring, like the city of Irvine, that they don't pay workers' comp. They're partially self-insured for their workers' comp, and it's probably through a captive. Okay. Individual companies, like a guy that owns a restaurant or 2 or 3, service stations or whatever, they can put a captive in, and there's about 73, or it changes a little bit based on the marketplace. Like they no longer cover COVID. But I have a client, I have an oral surgeon up in San Luis Obispo that was making a claim 2 years ago on the COVID, year ago. And but those things happen where there's insuring ransomware on your computer, changes in regulations, changes in residential codes, your business commercial codes, so you can't have your office there, changes in technology, changes in tax law, bad Yelp reviews, raising your deductible on your malpractice or your medical or your workers' comp. Anything that can have an interruption to the business is covered under the 831B. Now they're already insured. I mean, you walk down the street, every single one of those business owners, whether they know it or not, they're, if they don't know what an 831B captive is, it's just in their checkbook. I mean, somebody does something to them, or they have a one of the incidents that could be covered. Well, they're gonna pay for it. They're gonna pay 100 cents on the dollar, plus maybe legal fees if they're gonna fight it or anything like that. They're gonna pay every nickel of it out of their own pocket. So the 831B, the claims usually range in the pools like 3% a year of everybody's claims. So, yeah, but it's maxed at, right. I think the current max is 2.3 million. And I think somebody told me that they're going to probably start indexing that, because it went at 1.1 million forever, and then it jumped to 2.3, and they changed the regs on whether it could be 50% or 80% pooled, and they did a lot of stuff. So currently you can put 2.3 million. Yeah, so that's why some of my hypotheticals, I'm showing a 2.3 profit or a 4.6 profit, so that half of it could be in the ESOP, or all of it could be in the ESOP, or half of it could be in the captive. And in the current situation we hear right now that we have, the urgency is because of the CARES Act, the Secure Act, the CARES Act. Somebody can still do an ESOP for 2021 now, as long as they haven't filed their taxes. So if you know CPAs, or if you know business owners, and they're still dealing with, God, what am I going to do to get rid of this last $1 million? I don't want to pay tax on it. Well, they can do an ESOP retroactively into last year. Now, what we're showing in a lot of our illustrations is we show 2021 separately, where the whole deduction is going into the ESOP. Okay, but that's letting them keep the capital for that $2 million, and they now have it today still because they didn't pay tax on it from yesterday. That can be today's captive, or the split between the captive and the ESOP. So we're giving them capital going into the next tax year to pay for the captive now, and with the retroactive deduction from last year from the ESOP, from the paper deduction, generates the TURC, tax exempt retained capital. The TURC is available for contribution into the captive and or reinvestment. And then this gives us 3, 5, 6, 8 months this year to generate a more complete analysis. I mean, we're kind of in a fire sale for 2021. But that's a situation that's gold. I mean, be able to go back and say, hey, I give you retroactive, tell you what, you just print up some stock certificates, dump it in this trust, and now we've gotten rid of 2021.
Which is amazing. At the same time, my head is spinning because you're still talking to all these. I'm like, I'm trying to follow. I promise. But I know, Eric, you were. Well, the thing you asked was, it seems like there's really no downside to these, and I think the only thing I could think of, to me, there's 3 things I was thinking of. One is, will the business qualify? Basically, are they big enough to make it worthwhile? So that's one area. The second part was that certain employer groups are not eligible, or certain professions are not eligible. So that's a downside, not to the plan, but because you're in this profession, you can't do this. But that doesn't mean that you can't do something similar in some adapted way. You just can't do it this way. And so I would guess that whatever you got, you bring it back to Kelly, and let's look at it and see what can be done.
Yeah, lawyers can't do ESOPs. 15 years ago, anybody in a professional code could not do ESOPs. Architects, engineers, doctors, dentists, chiropractors, attorneys, and chiefs. Nobody could do ESOPs in that type of group. Over the years, every one of those groups, associations and bylaws and everything else have changed and modified to where you can do some form of an ESOP. Now, a one doctor head nurse doing $1 million a year of revenue, they're not of scale. They can't do it. And so there are some alternatives. If like with I have a law firm we're looking at right now, they're doing about 10 million. So we know that we could do about $1 million to $1.5 billion, maybe up to 2 million into a captive. So they put the money in the captive, they premium finance their life insurance, they fund their buy sell, through a life insurance LLC so that they don't have to, do the cross purchase or transfer for values or any of that other stuff down the road. They're putting their money into the captive to pre-fund later on when the older partner wants to leave in 16 years. And the law firms may be valued at $5 million and his share is 2.5, and there's 15 million sitting in the captive. Okay. And then they could sell it through the 453 monetized installment note code and avoid the capital gains for 30 years. So
the captive could be a form of self-financing the buyout. That's okay. See, things are starting to click. I'm getting there.
And so what happens? So the transition in 15 years is because they've been in the LLC. He takes his policy, he takes the sale of his share, dumps it in, pays off the premium financing. So now he has a paid up 15-year policy that was funding at $500,000 a year for 15 years. And that's his walkaway money. I mean, besides getting maybe a little extra cash more than paying off the premium financing, he's got the income coming out from a $10 million cash value. And that's not anything that, downplay, and that's tax-free. And that's better. That beats the hell out of a pension and an after-tax dollar funding a buy-sell agreement. So you can still do things, but there's a handful of groups or size of companies or type of corporation, type of business entity that we can't do it on. There's also the economies of scale. I mean, you can't do a captive on a $1 million company because both of the captive groups we work with have kind of a threshold of $200,000 a year premium or higher into the captive. And they have kind of a guideline of 5, not for everything. They do the full underwriting, but to avoid being overly aggressive, they tell people don't try to go higher than 5 at the most out 10% of premium compared to the revenue. Now that oral surgeon that I mentioned, his he's one doctor, one surgeon with about 23 staff, but he does 5 million a year. So in theory, his maximum was supposed to be 500,000 into the captive. Well, they underwrote him for 984,000 or something like that. But he chose to do like 600,000 because he wanted to make sure that next year and all that stuff would fall together correctly. But the downside, when I hear downside, I also think about what's likely to happen. No, the easiest thing to look at is what about tax legislation? Well, since 1974 and through into 76, when ERISA was first coming up, all these, I mean, you have KEOs. I haven't run across a KEO. Nobody does them anymore. You got pensions, profit sharing, all that kind of stuff. Well, I remember that when I first when I was in my first year in the business, as 76, there was at New York Life in Torrance, our leading agent was a guy named Max Baer, who was the mayor of Rolling Hills. And he had a doctor client that was doing about 3 million a year. And he was able to put like 90% of that 3 million into his pension. And then he'd take that money and the pension would buy a building. Then he would lease his office from the building that his pension owned. And obviously he paid high rent on a high interest loan to a high interest. I mean, and now again, that's
like transactions basically. So it's all copacetic. It's still deducted against the various.
Exactly. And it's all growing. It's all in his pocket. And that's not what pensions were intended to do necessarily. They were intended to help everybody. And Congress examined that, and they, as my mom would say, my Okie mom, Irish, hey, they threw the baby out with the bathwater. And pensions, profit sharing, 401ks, KEOs, they've been eviscerated. Every time there's a new Congress or a new, whatever, change in the White House or legitimate tax issues. Pensions take a hit. Profit sharing takes a hit. I mean, 401ks don't resemble the original 401k. And all the way along, ESOPs have been like the sacred cow. Nothing happens to them because both sides of the aisle like it. You know, the people that are capitalistic, tax driven, people that are kumbaya, you know, everybody's an owner kind of mentality. They both love it. And in fact, the only legislation that's taken effect over the last 50 years are additional things that are positive. Like when Reagan was in, is when they started adding things with interest rate deductions for banks as an incentive to lend to ESOPs. I mean, banks they only declared profit on half of their interest income on an ESOP loan. Now, when I read, I saw it yesterday as I was going through all these ESOP things. California, there's a legislation right now in California where they're going to give a $50,000 grant to any company installing an ESOP.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, that's in legislation right now. It's not in a floor committee. It's not in a subcommittee.
That's in, Colorado, yeah.
Yeah, California.
Oh, California. Oh, it's already in Colorado. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in Colorado.
Now,
And-
real quick, because James' time, I know he's got to leave at 11 o'clock. And so I want to make sure we get to any other remaining question he has. By the way, I looked on California Broker. That article isn't up yet, at least on their website. Anyway, so it might be in the magazine, but the magazine isn't there yet. And I thought of one more thing we could talk about in a moment, because the guy I talked to yesterday said that he did an ESOP, but about 5 years later they undid it because the adult children wanted to be involved in the business that was growing so well. So I don't know if I call that a downside, other than they had to unravel it.
Well, they didn't talk to the right people. They didn't have to unravel it.
Okay.
There's 2 or 3 different ways they could have amended that ESOP structure, and it would have kept the extreme growth. And they would have they shouldn't have had to they didn't have the right people.